Hello, and welcome to Getting the Answers. Today, we will be, of course, joined as usual with my glorious co host. Please introduce yourself.
Yes, hello. I'm Wyatt Berckenhoff at the Breakdown with Berckenhoff, or the Breakdown with WB on Twitch and D Live. And we have a very interesting topic to talk about for this week, especially.
Yeah, we had a different topic lined up, and unless things change interestingly, we'll probably have it next week, and that is immigration. But this week, because of emerging events, I have decided to switch the topic last minute to discussing the events that occurred yesterday in Washington, D.C. on the 7th of January, 2021.
Yes, it's definitely a very timely event as it happened yesterday and has pretty huge gratifications to maybe what's going to happen here in the future. I know a lot of people are putting a lot of attention to it as they probably should be, but I've heard many different theories as to how big it's going to become. Is it going to cause an anarchy movement? Is it going to cause the Republican Party to break into two? You hear all of these sort of theories come out of just this one event.
Yes, it certainly has been a very powerful event, and to describe what happened, there were a lot of protesters converging in Washington, D.C. On the 6th today. Yesterday is the 6th, the 7th is today. And on the 6th, they were all there, and Donald Trump gave a speech to a lot of the protesters. And afterwards, the protesters moved on to in the direction of the Capitol, where at that time the votes from the election were being counted. And as this process occurred, at one point, Mike Pence decided to announce that he would not reject any of the certified electors from certified by the states, which was the hope that people had on Trump's side, that this would occur, that Mike Pence would question the electors from certain states. And when Mike Pence stated that that's something that he would not do, I believe that that is when the crowd began getting more rowdy, and when they began to push forwards into the Capitol, and they ultimately forced themselves into the Capitol. Mike Pence and eventually the other congressmen were evacuated until they could resume after the Capitol was cleared of the protesters by, I would assume, the police, the Capitol Police, and the National Guard, and perhaps some involvement of the Secret Service. Obviously, at this time, not all details are available. However, it is worth noting that certainly violence did occur in these events, and at least one of the protesters was shot.
So, yeah, it was a Air Force lady veteran who was shot, who I believe was shot trying to get into the Capitol, or maybe I don't know for certain if she was already in the Capitol and tried to proceed further, or if she was shot in the process of going into the Capitol. I'm still unclear as the particulars there, but she was one person shot. And I was reading an article before we started where it states that there are 4 dead and 52 arrested as the latest number, and that may even be updated in here in the future, especially if the protests continue today, as some think they might.
Yes.
And I don't know if you were or anybody who's viewing now, but Stephen Ingaramus, who is a streamer on the Freedoms Group, was streaming this live, and he was actually in the Capitol building at parts, and it was rather interesting to
Did he enter
see.
illegally?
Well, he was with the way he stated it, and I don't want to get him necessarily in trouble. I don't know if he's going to publish that part or not, but anyway, the way he kind of sounded was he was towards the front of the group, not like the very front, but like not in the middle, but towards the front type of deal. And he was just following the large group of protesters, and then he was in the Capitol. I don't know how he got into the Capitol, if that was force or just following the group. So I don't know legally if what that would qualify under, but
Yeah.
anyway, that's kind of how he
yeah.
ended up in the Capitol.
Because this the illegal entry of the building is indeed a federal crime, and I believe that a lot of the protesters, assuming that this was not pre-planned or organized, don't really have a specific legal defense fund to deal with this in the same way that a lot of left-wing protesters usually do. So we should expect to see a lot of arrests coming from this, and a lot of people not being bailed up, a lot of people actually going to jail. And obviously, the primary targets will be the ones that actually engaged in violence against the police or in breaking into the building. Now, I don't know whether the prosecutors will choose to pursue the general crowd that may not have engaged in violence but may still have illegally trespassed onto the federal property. But it is worth noting that we should expect a large amount of arrests to occur after this.
For sure. And I've definitely heard the claim that that is a federal crime, and obviously that makes sense as to why it would be, for sure. It's just rather crazy that happened. And just to answer your question about if it was like organized, at least from what Stephen was saying and from what I've read, it didn't really seem like they had necessarily an agenda or like a proven plan of where they were going to go. I believe at one part, Stephen basically said that they started going towards the Capitol, most likely because of the Pence thing, but really it was just kind of a spontaneous thing and not like, hey, this is, our path. So they ended up in the Capitol because of most likely that motive. So from at least Stephen's perspective, being there, it didn't really have like an organized plot or structure to the protest.
Yeah, people tend to get caught up in a crowd in events such as these. For example, a street protest, when people marching along the street, if someone at the front of a protest turns down to another street, there is a decent possibility that the protest will accidentally follow from its planned course onto an unplanned course due to this event. Not because people are actively trying to violate the plan that they had, but rather because it's simply a crowd mentality.
Right, yeah. And I do know that they stayed in the Capitol for a good while, at least from his perspective. And he was thinking that they let him in the Capitol and let him stay for a little bit so that they could get, their whatever they wanted to out and not necessarily be violent, but, yell chants or whatever they necessarily want to do. Like they were still preventing more violence from happening. But then they kind of herded them out in a smart way, is kind of how Stephen phrased it. Like they all started to go out and didn't even really realize that it was kind of happening. So.
Yeah, and then afterwards, a stronger perimeter was set up. I do think that it is a failing of not necessarily the Capitol Police, because they may not have the resources to do this, but the general security of the area that people did manage to push their way into the Capitol. And especially considering that the crowd was almost entirely unarmed. So in that sense, I think that it is a big failing of the police, not necessarily simply the Capitol Police, but the police in aggregate, because I understand that there was cooperation between different elements here. So in that sense, I would say that under the ideal circumstances, this is something that should not have happened. They should have been able to keep the protesters out. But I'm sure that partially one of the reasons they didn't end up achieving this is because they didn't want to escalate the violence, which was a real possibility. If they had been determined not to let the protesters in, then that would necessarily have required them to escalate the violence, which is something that they clearly were unable or unwilling to do, I think is a better word here, because I'm pretty sure they have weapons. They are able to do these things, but they decided not to.
Yeah, that's probably the most realistic theory as to probably why that many people were able to get into the Capitol, because it is. I don't know if you ever seen like the movies like Olympus Has Fallen or the Capitol Has Fallen or whatever. There's like three of them now, I think. But the whole story is how like these terrorists break into the Capitol and control the Capitol building and are going to launch a nuke or whatever, the whole plot. But basically, the whole plot is them breaking into the Capitol, and it gives the whole story of that, and it makes it rather like intrinsic to how they're able to like corrupt this official, get in. So it's a very like almost like spy type of thing. But it brings up the whole idea of like, okay, that seems somewhat realistic to how it could possibly happen, but definitely a movie.
Yeah.
But the whole idea of thinking that just a group of people can break into the Capitol,
Yeah, a group of mostly unarmed people. That's that's a disgrace to the sergeants at arms of the House and Senate. But maybe they'll make a different security procedure in the future on that. Now, one thing that's surrounding this event is the media response afterwards, and a lot of it focused on particularly blaming Donald Trump for these events. Now, I've tried to find exact evidence of incitement by Donald Trump, but this is mostly based on a loose interpretation of his idea of fighting to win and such kinds of phrases, which he says relatively regularly and in ways that usually could not be construed to imply actual violence. So it seems to me that the media is, from my perspective, being a little bit unfair in their characterization of his words, because not only does Trump very frequently use similar language in non-violent ways, but very frequently the media excuses other individuals, such as Al Sharpton, for one, for using language that could be construed by some people as implying violence, but does not actually denote violence per se. So in that sense, I think that they are being very uncharitable in the way that they're representing what he said, but this obviously isn't very new in the sense that they've been doing this pretty much his whole presidency. However, the fact that at this point even Fox News has gone to this level certainly shows that there's unity in the media in who they decide to blame for this event.
Yeah, you definitely see that with a lot of like phrases they were starting to use against Trump, because media has done this for a long time, but it doesn't necessarily like every media platform, because before Trump lost the presidency, Fox News was generally on his side. Not always, but they kind of kept the more Trump base in their media coverage for sure. And then you had like your fringe Newsmax, what some Trump supporters knew about and were very Trump like in their coverage, but it wasn't really, I would consider, a mainstream platform. But the whole reason I kind of bring that up was a lot of, you see the same phrases being brought in the media when they're covering this story. And it's always necessarily been that way, but it's just kind of weird to think that all of these independent media outlets decide to cover the same story and using like the same phrases in how they cover it. But on another thing is one thing that Trump has always done, and I think it just got escalated here because of the protest, obviously, but when he's asked to, denounce white supremacy or deny protest or deny violence, he never really just outright says it. He's never like, I denounce white supremacy and that's it, or say something similar to that effect. He always kind of plays with words in the Trumpian way, and he doesn't necessarily outright denounce it and like in just
Well,
plain sit it.
I will point out that in both cases of white supremacy and the protests, he does, I would say, denounce them unambiguously, even if it does not come to what the media would want him to say in exact words. So I don't think that
Right.
he's trying to weasel his way out of denouncing these things. I think he's very direct in the way he denounces them. He simply isn't cooperative with how the media wants him to denounce them in the exact way. Now, when it concerns these protests, he did denounce them as they were happening. He told people to go home. He told people to remain nonviolent. And before the event, he encouraged people to be nonviolent as well. So the idea that Trump was, in the long term, dog whistling people to be violent, I think is entirely absurd.
Definitely don't agree with him like encouraging violence through his words, and I definitely also agree with your point of that you said it in a better way, but basically he does denounce or he does answer the question, but it's not necessarily the way media wants to see, or even for that matter, maybe general public wants to see sometimes. Um, but yeah, but even just looking at his Twitter and what he stated and everything throughout, because he's always on Twitter. Or anyway, he was tweeting a lot about please remain civil, respect the police, all these sort of phrases that everybody in their normal mind would think are good things for that matter. But also another good point about what you said, and what I think is probably a reason why a lot of these supporters didn't bring their guns, because in general the MAGA type of supporters and people that would travel to an event like this are either somebody who's going to stream it or try to video something to put on their Twitter or whatever, or it's going to be people who are hardcore supporters of Trump if they're going to make the effort to go there in person.
Uh,
So the
yeah.
whole and those people tend to have guns more than the left would tend to have guns in general. But
Yeah, I think Trump was locked out for about 12 hours from his account on Twitter, and at least a couple of his later tweets were deleted. I don't remember seeing the exact contents of those tweets, but it is worth noting that Twitter has decided to censor Trump in a way that is much greater than before, because previously it was decided that Twitter couldn't remove Trump because he was the president, and it was very important for the president to be able to communicate with the people as transparency, and that therefore Twitter shouldn't be able to ban Donald Trump because of the fact that he is the actual sitting president. But it seems that Twitter has certainly, or at least the executives, have lost their patience for Donald Trump and are now becoming more bold in the way that they censor him.
that is 100% the case, I think, for sure. Especially you're starting to see especially with Twitter denouncing him and or not really denouncing, but removing him for 12 hours and whatnot, is you're starting to even hear about people wanting to impeach Trump once again, but before he runs out of presidency. So in other words, I'm starting to see a major movement off of these protests and people that think he encouraged them, or at least didn't, not encourage them. You're starting to see a major push to people who want to see that impeachment happen before Trump technically gets removed from office on inauguration day. So I think that's a rather interesting claim that's come out of these protests as well.
I hope they try it, because most of these people are lawyers. So I want to see them have a debate on this, because from what I've seen, because I saw part of his speech earlier in that day, I I don't think that Donald Trump did anything that can be conclusively proven to be incitement. So I don't think that he is someone that they can get on this one. However, I'd like to see the arguments that are put forth. Now, that being said, I saw some international news. I think it was on Deutsche Welle, which is a German news program. They were calling this a coup attempt by Donald Trump.
Yeah.
It's very important that a lot of the foreign news in the United States, foreign news on the United States is based on the domestic news in the United States. So people will look at CNN, they'll look at the Associated Press, and they won't look at, let's say, the alternative networks. They'll look at the mainstream media in the US, and that's what they will report internationally. And I will say that this is absolutely not a coup attempt, not only because I don't think that Donald Trump incited the violence, but also because there is no real mechanism in this type of violence for which Donald Trump could actually have attained power, in the sense that people breaking into the Capitol unarmed and messing around in the city doesn't really put Trump in power. He's not taking over the Pentagon. He's not kicking out dissident congressmen. He's not doing any of these other things that you would expect to see in an actual coup. All that's happened is some people who were mostly unarmed decided to break into the Capitol and then were pushed out quite easily afterwards, once the National Guard had reorganized to face the danger. So in that sense, the idea that this is a coup attempt is absolutely laughable to me anyway.
Yeah. Because my understanding of how that would even work is it would have to be organized from, President Trump directly. And yes, Trump did popularize the protest, and I don't know if he necessarily let's put it this way. There's not a plan that everybody knew to follow when going into this protest. Trump maybe created this day to be a protest and talked about it, but he didn't necessarily have a full-blown plan or organization of what particularly was going to happen. So because there's not really any organization, I don't really see how there necessarily could be a coup from the start.
Yeah, what I'm essentially saying, it's too disorganized to be a coup.
Right. Yeah. Definitely.
Yeah, and I think that another reason why I don't think that Donald Trump should be blamed is that I think that the real culprit behind this might not be Donald Trump, but instead be Thomas Jefferson. It's a bold claim, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, and the reason I say this is when you have a large number of people who believe that they have been systemically disenfranchised to the degree that it cannot be said that they are being taxed with proper representation, and especially to the point that in many areas there are lockdowns that keep people from working, then the mentality of the people tends to turn into that the government is becoming tyrannical, the government is disregarding the will of the people. And under these are ideas similar to those of Thomas Jefferson when he was writing the Declaration of Independence. And so I think that this is a natural outcome from a country such as this, where students are taught in school that the founding fathers did was a good and virtuous thing. So when they are confronted with a situation that seems similar to the situation that led to the founding of this country, they believe that they are acting in the correct manner, that this is the correct response to this. Now, let me be very clear, YouTube. I'm not actually justifying this. I'm just explaining why I think people did this.
No, I definitely think the whole movement was sparked because people are feeling like the government doesn't listen to them or even respect them for that matter. Because there's definitely a difference between a government that listens to its people and a government that just outright disrespects its people. And I do think a lot of the supporters that went to this event feel disrespected, especially since their claims of voter fraud were almost shrugged off more than anything else. And most of these people, I would argue, do think that Trump actually won his presidency and not Joe Biden. But that whole claim of election fraud in YouTube doesn't go so well. So
Yeah. We're not really allowed to talk about it into much more depth on this platform anyway. But I will say that I do think that based on the founding principles of this country, the people that were protesting could make a case as to why their protest, to the extent that they broke into the Capitol, was justified. I wouldn't agree with that case because I have a different system of values, but it certainly makes sense that when people are taught these things in school, that this is the appropriate way to behave when people are disenfranchised. And when the government characterizes events such as the rebellion in Libya, in Syria, in Egypt, and in Ukraine as being justified for these similar reasons, then it shouldn't be a surprise that it could happen in this country.
yes, for sure. For sure, especially because a lot of the people in those actual places do, in general, feel disenfranchised by their government. And I do think media coverage plays a big role into how this created now, but especially history. I do think history oftentimes is a good predictor of what's going to happen in the future. So I do think that that's a good kind of perspective or idea as well. But the whole kind of debate I have in my head is if this was actually effective towards its cause. And I don't necessarily think that it was, but I do think that this protest was a lot less violent than a lot of other protests, especially modern or recent protests with, let's say, Black Lives Matter movements, where there seems to be more destruction than actual protest. But I don't know if even that claim is necessarily true. But I'm kind of arguing in my own head on if this was actually effective towards its movement or not.
I don't think it's effective in the sense that it would change the result of the election, but I do think it is effective in producing a certain political climate. So I do think that as events unfold, this will become normalized in the minds of many people. There are many people that admire what happened in Washington, D.C., among Americans. And as I said, this should be no surprise that they would admire what happened. Now, there are some people that denounce it wholeheartedly. But I think that we should expect to see similar events in the future. And while previously I had spoken that civil war was unlikely to happen in the United States, as events continue to unfold like this, it seems like it is increasingly likely. And I think it's funny in a sense that the principles that created this country could be the very same principles that will ultimately lead to its destruction.
Hmm. Yeah,
At least the political system. Yeah.
it'd be almost kind of a not necessarily a fitting end. I don't know if that's necessarily a good word for the country going to hell or whatever you want to use for phrase. But I do know a lot of people more who kind of lean right, such as like Matt Christensen, who I was listening to a little bit on this call-in show yesterday, and he has a lot of people that obviously call into his show because that's the whole premise of it. And he was kind of talking with a lot of people that day, and there seems to be a common theme that people see the protest potentially as good because now the government officials know so much that that a lot of percentage of people do not like them, and they think that that's a good thing that the government officials feel, in their words, more afraid of the people and not necessarily think that they have full control like puppets over the people.
Well, it could also lead to a reaction by the government to attempt to entrench its position and prevent this from happening again. So we may be likely to see an increase in gun legislation, an increase in censorship, not necessarily by the government, but certainly on social media, privately owned in that sense. And I think under a Biden presidency that holds both the House of Representatives and the Senate, we certainly will see a situation that will allow an increase in control of society by the government, as they will have the means to affect this.
Yes, I definitely think that that could very much be truthful, for a very good claim, because I know Ben Shapiro is one person I listened to recently because I was interested to hear his opinion. I don't I don't particularly like Ben Shapiro that much. I want to make sure I state that clearly. But he was mentioning that he was mostly afraid of the Biden administration because of Second Amendment rights, and he thought that there was going to be much more stricter gun laws even before this protest started. And now that the protest has ended, maybe if it doesn't happen again today, I do think that stronger gun legislation could very well be true in the future here. And Biden has almost kind of said it himself. I don't know if you've looked at Biden's gun plan on his website. I've briefly looked, but there's a YouTuber has a very good breakdown of it, and he was basically just saying that if this plan were to get enacted, the whole Second Amendment rights could be a very big problem. And then also, if you believe the stock market, the whole Twitter, Facebook, and all like the social media companies, stocks have gone drastically down. And a lot of people who kind of predict those things think it's because of potential censorship that could happen on the platforms.
Yeah, and also it's worth noting that people did find pipe bombs in Washington, D.C. There was even a pipe bomb at the Republican National Committee. So perhaps an attempted terrorist attack on the Republican Party, which is interesting that this happened at the same time. And of course, the elections in Georgia have been called in favor of the Democratic candidates. So the Democrats will certainly have a majority in the Senate, as well as the House, which they already do.
Yeah, the Senate, they're 50-50, right?
I'd have to look at the numbers exactly. It's either 50 or 51. And
But either way, they have Kamala Harris if it's 50, so yeah.
yeah, they have the tie-breaking vote, so they'll be able to pull that through. So at this point, there's, I think, no possibility for Donald Trump to win, since he doesn't have the support of Mike Pence. He doesn't have the support of a lot of the Republicans, even though some continued to debate his side in the Senate. They were, of course, outnumbered by both the Democrats and the establishment Republicans and moderate Republicans who opposed Donald Trump. And I think this is very interesting that there are so many Republicans that oppose Donald Trump, because one of the major complaints I had about recent politics on the Republican Party is that a lot of politicians realign themselves and discussed politics in terms of Donald Trump's position, as in they describe themselves as a Trump conservative, someone who agrees with Trump on various issues, and the Republican Party didn't have a platform. They simply followed Trump's second term agenda instead of having its own political platform. And now suddenly, all these people that said they were in favor of Trump ultimately aren't. Now, I don't think that Trump is the best president. I think he's sort of mediocre. He's middle of the line. I think there certainly have been better presidents, and there certainly have been worse presidents. But I do think that the situation as it is unfolding will leave the Republican Party in an identity crisis where the party establishment has essentially told the base that they were the party of Trump, and now have decided suddenly that they don't like Trump at all. So that's going to lead to an identity crisis in the Republican Party. The Democrats already have a problem with the conflict between the progressives and the establishment and the Antifa type people, but the Republicans are now also having a major problem. And it could be that violence will escalate as time passes, that while we are talking about Washington, D.C., what happened in Washington, it is worth noting that similar protests happened throughout the country at various state capitals. I'm not aware of any that actually invaded the Capitol in the same way as occurred in Washington. However, these are nationwide protests that occurred.
Sure. And I've definitely been thinking to myself about like basically the question of which party do I think is more fractured, or and you could almost extend that question to which party is going to split, like actually become separate parties. And I do think those two questions have different answers. And I guess I'll start with the first one. I do think before this whole protest started, and more reasons to what you were just saying about the party not running with platforms and whatnot, I do think the Republican Party now appears to be more fractured. And I don't know if that's necessarily because of recency bias or anything, where that's the latest example of what I see, which could be the case. But beforehand, I always thought it was more the progressive left because they are a very vocal crowd. So I thought that they could potentially split. Now, the second question is I don't think it's necessarily smart for candidates to split into a separate party because third parties do not do particularly well in politics. So I don't necessarily think that a third party will ever form out of one of these parties, but more the parties would have to adapt a certain behavior of the fractured party. So I don't know if that necessarily answers the questions fully, but that's how at least I processed it in my head recently. But
Well, the way it would work in a two-party system, having an effective multi-party system, when there's ideally only two candidates in an election, because that's really the only way you can win, is to essentially have the idea of compromise candidates or multi-party candidates that are appointed by multiple parties, and that then the parties will negotiate with each other. Sort of similar to how within the party structure there are different positions. However, in this case, it would be more formalized, and there would be a more unified position of different parties. And that's something that I would say would be viable in a winner-takes-all system like the US has. Now, obviously, I would say the Democrats at this point, because they have a majority in the House at least, they don't really have to worry about unity as much as the Republicans do, because they can afford to have a few dissenters, and that won't ruin their position, even though they lost a few seats in the House. They can afford to have people that disagree with them because they are in government. Now, in the Senate, it would be a bit more difficult, but they can probably get a few of the moderate and establishment Republicans to agree with their positions. So, in that sense, politics will change it in that way. However, the real question is how much will the violence escalate and how fast will it escalate? Will we be waiting on this for a few months before a next major event happens, or will we start seeing events happening time after time, and an acceleration of the decay of polite politics? That is.
Yeah, that's definitely the next debate coming off of these protests because, like I kind of mentioned earlier in this episode here, is if it's going to happen today or tomorrow, but probably most likely if the protests were to continue, I would think it would have to happen today to push the movement a little bit more forward for that question. But I don't necessarily think that it is going to happen today, at least as much as it did yesterday. So I do think that we are potentially looking for an inauguration day event that's going to be very interesting type of idea, and security is it's going to be very interesting. And I do think that the next event's going to be inauguration day. So I don't see a slow build up more than I see a a huge event happening on that day.
That is true. However, we have to remember that a lot of people are out of a job. And when people are out of a job, they find things to busy themselves with other than a job because they don't have one. So, in that sense, someone who doesn't have to go to work, let's say 5 days a week, and instead has the entire week off, can afford to spend the entire week protesting because he's not really losing anything by doing it, because he can't have a job, he can't find a job because of various lockdowns or some things. So in that sense, we will see perhaps a smaller crowd of more dedicated long-term protesters who, for their frustration, maybe will escalate violence. But I do agree that Inauguration Day will be a major event. There will be huge protests. If Donald Trump is impeached, there will be huge protests. But beyond that, it's hard to tell at this point. It depends on the government's actions. It depends on whether there will be more lockdowns, more curfews, whether people will check for guns. I heard that the leader of the Proud Boys got arrested for having guns in an area where he shouldn't have had guns. So in that sense, we are seeing things move and happen. A lot of stuff happened yesterday. You probably have only touched on a small part of it. However, we certainly will remain alert as to what's happening in the future.
Yes, very much so. I do think that a lot of people who go out to these protests are people that vehemently agree with what Trump has to say, more than necessarily like the blogger types like I was mentioning earlier that are only there to kind of capture the moment. So I do think there very well could be a small group of protesters. The only thing would be how big is that small group that is continuously protesting would determine how much the movement has gained. I don't know if that particularly makes sense, but in other words, I do think that there could very well be people that continuously protest, but I do think the next major event is going to be at the inauguration day that's going to get, a mass amount of coverage more than maybe something happening every other day like it was when, George Floyd died and the protest started then.
Yeah. The moment that we know for sure that things are headed toward a point of high escalation is when someone who is in office chooses to avow the violence. In which case, then we know that things will certainly escalate at that point. But as far as I'm aware, that hasn't happened yet. But let's say one of the congressmen chooses to say that these events were justified. then we are looking at the beginning of a potential civil war as people in power begin to support the events, because that's usually what these kinds of escalations require. People in power choosing to support the event in some way.
Yeah, because you definitely have for the Congress, or sorry, for the senator types like Ted Cruz, who has been vehemently with Trump for this entire process, really, and was in charge of the lawsuit that was going to go to the Supreme Court, but it ended up getting denied a couple months ago now. Anyway, but he's kind of been towards Trump, so this entire thing. So if someone, especially like Ted Cruz, who's generally very well known, were to approve the protest, for lack of better words, I do think that you could very much see a potential civil war, like you were talking about, for sure.
Yeah, but
That
I personally don't think that Ted Cruz would be the
I
kind
don't
of
think he
person.
would. No, no, I think he's smarter than that. But yeah,
Yeah,
I
but
just bring him up
yeah,
as
I do think
example.
that I don't know everybody who's in Congress. There's probably someone there's probably a few people in Congress who do sympathize with the protesters, as there are clearly people across the country who sympathize with the protesters, even if saying so out loud and in public is risky. I'm pretty sure that there are a lot of people who are very much in support of these events, and that alone as a fact will lead to the potential escalation.
Yes, for sure. Because people, even who are protesting, maybe even the government themselves, it's not particularly like the supporters are going against the government per se, like Antifa, you would think is more the person who is a protesting group against the government. But I do think there's a lot of feel of these recent protests where people are simply protesting against the government. So, but they're still their movement would still be approved if somebody like a congressman were to endorse it or at least approve of what they did. Like people are still, even in these protests, searching for approval of what they have done, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I'm going to coin this term here. I'm going to refer to the protesters as Jeffersonians, because
Jeffersonians.
yeah, because that's how I think that's what I think their general idea is. They're not trying to they're not trying to destroy the government. They're not trying to only fight because the person they prefer lost. They believe that they have been genuinely, systematically disenfranchised, and that is what is causing them to rise up.
Hmm. Yeah, I definitely agree with that perspective for sure. Because I do think that that's the mass amount of protesters that went into this event were believing that and believe that the government isn't even really listening to them for that matter. So I do think that that's a term that could catch on.
Yeah, yeah, and I'm not saying this necessarily as an external compliment, although internally I'm pretty sure they would find it very complimentary. But I am saying it because I think it is a reasonable assessment of a mindset
Yeah, yeah.
of the idea of classical liberalism and the right to rebel when a government has disenfranchised the people. The idea that Jefferson put forward of having a little rebellion from time to time, and the tree of liberty being watered by the blood of patriots and tyrants. Those are all the sort of Jeffersonian ideas that I think are very influential among these kinds of protesters. They're not the necessarily the Antifa types. I don't. I know that there are some Boogaloo boys out there, but I think that the vast majority of the crowd is more interested in the founding fathers and those kinds of ideas.
It definitely seems to be a movement, at least this most recent movement, towards I guess you could even say towards liberty more than towards I don't know what another movement would be, but it definitely seems more a liberty type of protest more than any other type of protest.
Yeah. So anyway, I think I've exhausted what I've wanted to say about this. Do you have anything you'd like to add?
No, I think we definitely covered all of what I was particularly thinking about this protesting event. I guess the only other kind of question I had, which isn't well, the only other question I had was, what do you how do I say this? If the protest were to continue in these next couple of weeks, do you see it like you were describing earlier as maybe like a small gathering of people, or how do you necessarily see the protests forming if you think they are to continue?
Well, it'll be a smaller group of people until a next major event happens, such as either a Donald Trump impeachment or the inauguration, in which case a larger crowd will form again. I think you could compare it to perhaps the street fights that have been going on in Portland, where it's not always huge crowds of protesters, but it is smaller, more dedicated gangs, not necessarily seeking to fight each other, but certainly ending up fighting each other due to their strong opposition to each other. So we will probably see an increasing presence of counter protesters in Washington, D.C., who oppose the protesters who are in favor of Trump, probably drawn from perhaps Antifa, although some people are saying that there could be an overlap between the people who stormed Washington, D.C., being both pro-Trump and having some Antifa people in there as well. As obviously anarchists would like to exploit such a situation. However, ultimately, the opposition of their political views will probably not lead to any long-term alliance. So we will be seeing perhaps small gangs of people, not necessarily intending to do violence, but being more ready to do violence.
I definitely could see that happening if they were to continue. That definitely makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I don't really have anything necessarily else to add. I think we covered all of the talking points I had in my head.
Okay, so in that case, I think that we should stop. Next week, unless something major happens that we would like to discuss, we'll probably be discussing immigration. But until then, stay tuned to the news. You can follow both of our channels on YouTube. I'm also available on BitChute. So thank you all for watching.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Yeah. Goodbye.